welcome everyone to Lessons from the Lab from the AANEM. My name is Devon Rubin from Mayo Clinic in Jacksonville, Florida, and it's a pleasure to host another episode of this Lessons from the Lab. This is a special episode, our second live episode. So welcome to the attendees who have come on and spending some of your late afternoon or evening or middle of the night, if wherever you are with us. Hopefully this will be worthwhile and we'll have some fun and learn from each other. It's a pleasure to have a guest host today, Dr. Chris Lamb. Hi, Chris.
Hey, glad to
Chris
be
is,
here.
yeah, Chris is a colleague of mine. He's a neurologist and a neuromuscular specialist with me at Mayo Clinic in Florida. And we work quite a bit together. We share cases, we talk about cases. So it's fun to do this outside of the lab with you, Chris, and pick each other's brains and try to learn from each other and learn from others. So
Yeah, I'm
thanks for
looking forward
joining
to it.
me.
Yeah, this is great. Thanks so much for inviting me. Long time listener, first time caller.
Yeah,
I love
right.
I love the program. So happy to get to add my 2 cents to it.
Put all your likes on, wherever you put your likes on whatever platform. Uh, it's been what, 2 hours since I've seen you? We're not in the
Yeah,
lab
a whole
now.
two
So
hours. We
a
almost
whole,
made it. Yeah,
yeah, yeah. Anyway, we're having a great summer here in Florida. You know what time of the year it is, right, Chris?
it's hurricane season.
It's hurricane season, it's resident training season, it's Olympic season. So we've been involved in all of that.
Yeah.
And have you seen anything interesting on the Olympics?
Oh yeah. I've been watching a lot of the Olympics. I don't know if you saw this, but the Polish women's speed climbing champion climbed this wall in 6 seconds. Did you see that?
Wow. They're
Yeah.
like rock climbers.
She set two world records, one right after the other, on
Wow.
this wall in 6 seconds. So, and I saw the blurb come through about a rock climber. I had to pay attention. I knew I had to pay attention to the rock climbing events on the Olympics.
Yeah, I mean that's relevant because the case we're going to discuss has something to do with rock climbing. Have you ever rock climbed, by the way?
No,
No, me neither. I like to keep my
but
feet on the ground.
I have an unfair advantage.
Yeah. Okay, well, we'll talk a little bit about rock climbing. It'd be interesting, as I was thinking about the case, and you don't know this case, I don't think, but I was thinking with rock climbing, how many different neuromuscular conditions can you get with from rock climbing? You could get
Boy,
this elevated CK, right?
you could easily.
You
Yeah.
could you could probably get carpal tunnel. You could probably get a
Ulnar,
ulnar,
cervical
probably get
radic,
lots of neuropathies,
trauma, any trauma. Yeah. I mean, basically
head
everything.
head injury. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, we're not here to talk about sports. Um, so I think so. What we're going to do, if those of you, if anyone hasn't watched the lessons from the lab, what I would like to do is present a case to everyone, including you, Chris. It's an unknown case, and because this is a live episode, we'll kind of gauge some discussion, and some of that we might be asking some questions you can answer through chat. We'll be monitoring the chat. We'll try to monitor the question and answer set question and answers as well. So feel free to use that. And then if you do want to answer something verbally or have a comment, uh, raise your hand and we'll try to unmute you. The hardest part about this is figuring out all the IT and the technical aspect, but we can unmute you so you can answer or ask something if you'd like. So I think we'll get to it. And let me just share my screen here. Okay, so can you see that?
Yep.
It's funny, if any of you have watched some of the previous episodes of Lessons from the Lab, the last one, which was a fantastic one, was with Dr. Sanders and Massey. And I was talking to them and sharing some waveforms with them. And about halfway through, they're answering all the questions correctly. but then they say, we haven't been able to see any of your waveforms. So I want to make sure you can see what I'm showing you this time. All right. Well,
I see it.
anyway, here's the case. This is a bit of a head scratcher. It's an interesting case, and we did a lot, so we'll have a lot of discussion and a lot to show here, I think. But the case was a young man, a 21-year-old healthy man, no medical problems. He was a rock climbing enthusiast, so he wasn't in the Olympics, but he did this for a hobby. He did this. He was very active and did this on a regular basis. And he wasn't rock climbing when he had his problem, but he was working out in the gym, and he was involved in a very prolonged workout using multiple weights. He was part of that was biceps curls in the gym, and immediately after he did his weight program, he noted some weakness in the left arm, and it was in his elbow flexion. He didn't have any pain with it anywhere, no neck pain, no arm pain, no shoulder pain. So it's just weakness. And he also noted an unusual sensation, and he described it as a warm, tingly-like sensation down the side of his left arm, and some reduction in the sensation in the lateral and posterior aspect of his arm. So kind of up here by the deltoid and the triceps area, he had a sensory deficit, or he had sensory symptoms. And then over the next few weeks, he started regaining the sensation. That unusual sensation went away, and he started regaining the strength in his arm. And by about 3 months after onset, his strength and sensation were almost back to normal. He thought it was still a little bit off, but pretty much could do everything that he wanted to do. So he came to to seek attention. And when he came to Mayo and was evaluated, his neurologic examination was pretty unremarkable, except for the left arm. He had mild weakness of his biceps, and he had an absent brachioradialis and biceps reflex, and his sensation was otherwise normal. And that was it. Nothing else, everything else was normal on his exam. So pretty straightforward, huh?
I'm
What,
scratching my head,
yeah,
but he
well,
can't. He
I do
can't
every
get up there,
day.
I guess. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I don't know if I'll pause here and see if you or anyone who's listening or watching has any questions about the history or the exam or anything else about this patient. And you can use the chat, or you can raise your hand if you want to ask anything.
Well, while some questions are brewing, I might like to know, is this the first kind of, is this the first time this sort of a thing has happened to him in his life? Or if you ask him a little more, can he think back to a time when he had weakness in the other hand for a period of time that resolved, or in the feet or something like that?
Yeah, he had never had anything like this before,
Okay.
and never had anything in the arm or in the leg or any unusual transient neurologic symptoms that he can recall. He had one episode. He did say that he had undergone some anesthesia for a minor procedure, and he had entire body stiffness that lasted for a few hours afterwards, and then it resolved,
Oh,
which,
okay.
whatever. I don't know what that is.
I
Maybe
don't
that's
either.
that's maybe for the lessons of the lab EEG session.
Looks like we have one question about the sensory exam in the lateral forearm. Was that completely normal?
It was normal. Yes.
That's a good question. I mean, when you're thinking about positive sensory phenomenon, it's nice to know, are there any negative phenomena that go with it? But I guess it
Yeah.
sounds like there weren't any. No normal
Right.
pinprick and everything. Okay.
Right.
And
So
and
any
are
other?
you gonna,
Oh, go ahead.
oh yeah. Are you gonna tell us any of his other, I mean, maybe there was none, but does he have anything in his, he's fairly young, makes me wonder about his family history.
So first of all, no neck pain, no pop sensation in the neck at the time of his workout. Nothing unusual. and no pain anywhere. And in terms of family history, so medical history, he had nothing else. He wasn't on any medication. He didn't have any, I don't remember exactly, but I don't think he smoked or used alcohol regularly. Family history, he had said there was nothing like this in the family, where someone had an episode of weakness. He did say that he thinks that his mother and grandmother may have had some neuropathy type symptoms, with some tingling in their feet that he recalls them talking about, but he wasn't completely sure of that.
Okay. And that's not so uncommon anyway. So I always wonder what to do with that when I hear that kind of family history, but I usually file it away somewhere.
Is there anything else you would specifically ask? I've asked this to others during these lessons. When you're asking family history, in this case, would you say, I mean, how would you word the question to the patient about family history?
When I'm thinking about it, family history and neuropathy, it does require a little more detailed questioning from time to time. I mean, the fact that he knows that his family have a neuropathy is somewhat unusual. It can go under recognized, and so for that reason, I often ask about whether there are foot deformities in the family. And I ask about brothers and sisters, especially because people often talk about their parents. If you just ask about family history, they may not mention the fact that their brother or sister has high arches and hammer toes, or was had to have foot surgeries or something like that, which could be some other subtle clues of a familial neuropathy. And then it's also important. I don't know. He's 21. He may not have, but if they have a kid, it's important to ask about their children. And people don't always talk about the children right off the bat if you just ask about the family history. Someone's asking, was there a preceding viral infection or a rash, which is another interesting question.
Yeah, he didn't have any of that. Nothing
Okay.
unusual. No infection, no immunization, no rash, nothing.
And this was a warm tingling sensation, but it was basically painless, he said.
Correct. Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. So, okay. So, yeah, so that's basically the story in the exam. So the thing that we do when we're seeing patients in clinic or EMG, the stepwise thought process is, can we localize this just on our clinical basis? And any thoughts? And people can again raise hand or use chat or just listen to us talk about possible localization here.
Well, I do think this is a neurologic problem, being that it is a neurologic webinar in the ANEM, but I always start there. Uh, and then this seems to be fairly focal, limited to the biceps, and it's painless, which is useful, but there is maybe some sensory phenomena. So I think about the peripheral nerve, and in particular, I'm thinking about because of those reflexes, both of them being down, brachioradialis and biceps, thinking about C5 and C6 roots, thinking about the upper trunk of the brachial plexus, thinking about lateral cord and the posterior cord, and thinking about the musculocutaneous and radial nerves. But if it's just simply one lesion, then it might be easiest to invoke. Well, it's hard to know right off the bat whether it's one thing or two things, but it got better on its own. So that's another feature.
Yeah.
I don't think, based on the fact that there are sensory features, I don't think it's a neuromuscular junction problem or a focal myopathy. I think that is being
Mhm.
less likely.
Yeah. And I agree. I mean, I think it's hard to know. We always joke, we learn this anatomy and this localization, this which muscles are supplied, from the C5 or C6 roots in the upper trunk of the plexus. But it's patients who have lesions in those areas. Not every single muscle is equally affected to the same degree. So it makes it more challenging. It makes it more fun sometimes. It makes us scratch our head to know exactly where this is. And here the weakness is only in the biceps. So, and then you have this brachioradialis absent that doesn't fit into just a musculocutaneous nerve. And he doesn't have other weakness in upper trunk or C6 muscles. So it makes it tough. And this is sometimes why we do EMG, right? To try to help us sort out the localization.
If only we had some kind of a clinical tool that would help us sort through these things.
Yeah, right. Fortunately, we do. So would you do an EMG if you in this patient if you were seeing him?
I would, or at least I would ask him if he would like to. I wouldn't just
Most
do it.
patients that you ask don't say, I would love to have an EMG, but
Well, you haven't asked nicely enough, though.
yeah, I guess that's the problem. But I mean, the argument is he's almost better. So,
Yeah, well,
it's
that's
kind of
true.
like why he's even coming to the doctor because he's improved. And lots of 21-year-olds would be like, something weird happened. I'm better.
Yeah. No, but on a serious note, I don't think if it depends on the person, but he's fairly young. This is something that could definitely impact his function. So I would be more apt to investigate it.
Hmm.
But I think if you had somebody who was, very averse to procedure or who was very cautious and felt like things were really getting better, and then I might recommend surveillance, and just I don't think that's totally the wrong call, but being that he's so young, it was interfering with his rock climbing, I'm sure
Yeah.
probably go ahead.
And it's unusual, right? It's unusual for someone for 21 to have this sudden weakness. So, right. I mean, you want to know as much as you can, what this was so you can prevent it from happening again or, treat if it's something treatable, if it happens again. So I agree. I think because it's so unusual, it's worth working up and looking into. So, and he did not have any fall. Someone asked if he had fallen. I don't remember where he climbed, where he does his rock climbing. So let's talk about neurophysiology for EMG. So he's here. He's going to have the EMG. So I'll throw this out to anyone who wants to answer, and you can kind of just throw some things out. But what would you do on an EMG here if you're starting, let's just say we start with the nerve conductions, which we do in our lab. You could argue you start with the needle exam first, but we're going to start with nerve conduction studies. Which nerve conduction studies would you perform in someone like this? And as people might want to answer, if you want to, Chris, I'll ask you,
Yeah,
what would you start with here?
I think I would start with the, with our even though he wasn't necessarily weak in his hand or in the median motor, I might start with that. Start with a good median motor nerve conduction because uh, and you want to go where the money is eventually. It's not like we're going to completely ignore his biceps, of course, but we're trying to see how local is this really? Is there a subclinical involvement of some of the other nerves that may be coursing through the brachial plexus and through the nerve roots? So
Mhm.
that's probably where I would that's probably where I would start.
It's a
With some
lot
of the
easier to do a median motor conduction study too than do a musculocutaneous motor conduction study,
it
just
is
from a
easier.
technical standpoint. Yeah. Okay. Actually that's what was done. I'm gonna show some. We have we This is going to be like the Olympics of nerve conduction studies. There were quite a few things that were done here, but this was his median motor study. So on the affected side. And for those of you who aren't familiar with our setup, just to help you, and so we don't belabor some of these conductions, the values that we have for our lab reference values are highlighted in red or green, green being within normal limits for our current reference values, and red being outside of normal limits. So in this patient, the median motor distal latency was slightly prolonged. It should be less than 4.5 in our laboratory. So, um, what do you think about this?
I I I believe this, and uh, I think you get so much information from one nerve conduction. It's hard to explain all the thoughts that run through your head when you see one. But I think I'm interested that the latency is long. It should be less than 4.5, and especially in a 21-year-old, uh, 4.7 is very long. So there needs to be an explanation for that. And then the other thing I noticed right off the bat is that the current given there is 82 at the wrist, if I'm reading that correctly,
Mhm.
which is fairly high. Uh, we don't always have to, in a 21-year-old healthy athletic man, we don't always have to go that high to get a response. So um, if you see that, you want to make sure, of course, you're not overstimulating at the wrist and bringing in another nerve there. And you have to watch the twitch and make sure of that. But it makes me cautiously want to look at the median sensory and see, does this guy have a median neuropathy at the wrist?
Okay. Yeah, why don't shouldn't we just give 82 milliamps one time and they just need one shock
Yeah, well, that's why you have such a hard time getting people to go
to
to
do
do an
nerve
EMG.
conductions? Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, we joke, but I think some people probably do that. They think, well, let's give fewer shocks and just give a large shock. But to your point, you could be overstimulating and spreading to the ulnar nerve. I've seen that happen in people who have very severe median neuropathies where there's no APB response. I don't think that's the case here because this looks like a median motor response, not an ulnar response. But right, you may be overstimulating and giving way too much stimulus than you need, and that's gonna affect patient tolerance too. So we go up, as you know, we go up in 5 to 10 milliamp increments with each stimulus here. So, but if this is all, technically reliable, which it looks like, and it's not overstimulating, you want to see the median sensory to see if that's prolonged also.
yeah, and and I have this sneaking outside suspicion about multiple mononeuropathy kind of a problem. I guess that's what gut instinct is forming after the case presentation and now after seeing this first conduction. So
Mhm.
that's where my mind is going
But to argue that common things being common, isn't a median neuropathy at the wrist common? We see carpal tunnel all the time.
all the time. So it could just be an incidental problem that has nothing to do with presentation, of course.
And then to argue against myself, what about carpal tunnel in a 21-year-old? We
Yeah,
don't
we
see
don't
that
see
all
that
the
every
time,
day.
right?
No,
Yeah.
no.
And then the third argument against myself going round and round is what about carpal tunnel in a 21-year-old rock climber? So I don't know.
Maybe he does
Right?
get it.
I mean,
Yeah, I think
it's,
I'm just going to turn off my video and let you argue with yourself.
I know I'll be spinning around, but no, I mean, I think we said at the beginning, what kind of injuries can rock climbers get? So, I agree. It's unusual in a 21-year-old to have carpal tunnel syndrome or median neuropathy at the wrist. But if he is
Yep,
using his hands a lot, maybe it isn't for him,
right.
right? So maybe that's just a secondary to intermittent compression because he's grabbing onto these ledges and rocks. So anyway, okay. So we did do F waves also. And compared to our estimated F wave latency, this was within normal limits. So nothing to indicate real proximal slowing. And then we did, before going to the sensory, what we often do since we're in the motors is do a different nerve. So you were worried about other mononeuropathies, you said.
Yeah.
So what nerve would you do?
Well, I have a feeling you're going to show me the ulnar nerve here because that's our typical paradigm.
Someone asked radial, so
Somebody
maybe
asked for
radial.
radial.
at
I don't think
multiple
that's
levels.
wrong either. Yeah, I think that I would be interested to see the radial.
Okay. I mean, we could do every nerve too, but
Yeah, might as well, right?
yeah.
But
So
but in all seriousness, I think doing the median and the ulnar, and again, we're looking for involvement and sparing because localization is about knowing about where something is and where something isn't. So seeing a normal conduction, although you pulled this up and it's not normal, but seeing a normal conduction helps you contain or bracket the problem and show us
mhm.
where it isn't if it is a focal problem. So versus a diffuse one. But I guess this one, just right off the jump here, looking abnormal.
Yeah, now we're instead of helping us, we're getting more complicated and confused.
We are gonna end up doing all the nerves at the
I
end of the day.
know. So yeah, so this was the ulnar motor at wrist below and above elbow, and uh what catches your eye here?
Well, right to begin with, my eye is drawn to the difference between the elbow and below elbow conduction velocity of 11. Uh, Differences greater than 10 suggests slowing across the elbow there, and even alone may meet the criterion for ulnar neuropathy at the elbow. But you want to verify that, as we said before. You want to make sure your distances are correct. You're not overstimulating or understimulating at the different points. And then the latency is right there at the borderline. It should be less than 3.6 for the motor distal latency. It's at 3.6. Am interested in that. I mean, again, this is a young man. I wouldn't expect that for him. I mean, I would
Yeah,
expect a young 21-year-old man to have a nice latency on the ulnar motor.
yeah,
And then, you can think about some differences between the amplitudes between the above and below elbow site. Maybe it's 10% difference, but I don't think of that as being a huge feature. I'm mostly interested in that slowing.
yeah, right here. It's more than 10 meters per second slowed. So and again, he's a rock climber. So does could he have ulnar neuropathy and median neuropathy? I think we're both probably thinking that'd be unusual, but is this a profession related compressions or is there something else?
And he's a young guy and he's active, and maybe he's not paying that close attention to how many times he's fallen down and bumped his elbow or bumped his wrist. And
Hmm.
this is the
Yeah,
time when you're doing the conductions and you look at these results and you say, have you ever fallen and hit your elbow and fallen and hit your wrist? And you might gather additional history some when you're
right.
seeing these
Yeah.
results.
Yeah. So I'm gonna see if anyone else wants to type in the chat or in the question what other conductions you would want to see or you would perform if you were doing the EMG on this patient. So we have a median motor, we have an ulnar motor. Both of them are showing some abnormalities. Anyone want to either speak or type in what else you would do? Mike Skolka, Dr. Skolka, I'm going to allow you to talk. You can unmute yourself.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
All
Hey,
right.
Mike.
Hey, everybody. Um, so yeah, no, I agree. I think at this point I'd be thinking about I want to see some sensory studies. So median antidromic, ulnar antidromic. I also think, a radial is not a bad idea either, just to get another nerve, especially with the distribution of some of his symptoms.
Radial motor or radial sensory or both?
I'd be interested. Well, I'd want to see what the sensory studies showed. I was thinking radial motor, um, probably, but I'm interested to see what these next sensory shows too.
Okay, good. Anyone else? Let's see. We have some people uh median and radial sensory, median radial. Someone wants a lateral anabrachial, and a couple people want that.
Good.
Okay, as a continuation of musculocutaneous. Good.
Definitely.
Yeah. And what about maybe a musculocutaneous motor? We don't do that very as often as the others. So that might be, that's where he's weak. You go where the money is. So maybe that's something we would do.
And of course, compare it to the other side.
Yeah. Yep. Okay. Good. Good thoughts. So let me go through. I'm just going to go through some of the other conductions, and then we'll discuss them. So the ulnar motor F waves were normal, and they did do inching, or text did inching on the ulnar, and it did show focal slowing here. You can see a shift in the latency here, and that was, it's hard to see, but that was at the retrocondylar groove. So at a site of compression, probably from all of his falls from rock climbing. Okay, some opposite hand. Okay, so then here's the ulnar sensory. So Chris, I'll ask you, I nothing was marked here. They didn't mark the amplitude. Would you have marked this?
I don't know that, you know, I'd like to see other traces, but I'm not sure whether that broad response that's linked to the subsequent large response is motor artifact. I
Mhm.
don't think I would feel confident about marking it.
Yeah, this is something that doesn't happen that rarely. I mean, we see this a lot, and I agree with you. You know, people I think could easily mark this as the sensory, and then we know this is the broad motor artifact, which is a common in an ulnar antidromic study. And but we don't know. This is pretty broad for a sensory response. And I think I'm always uncomfortable when there's a waveform riding on the motor artifact, knowing whether that's sensory or motor. And my suspicion is it's motor artifact. Um, there are a couple ways that you could try to tease that out technically. One is move the electrode on the ring finger, on the pinky finger, more distal, and that often will reduce that motor artifact. And also, if you move it more distal, still stimulating at the same spot, so your distance is longer, if it's a true sensory response, the latency is going to shift to the right. If you have a longer distance, if it's a volume conducted motor response, it's not going to shift because it's not conducting through the nerve. So those are some little clues or tricks that you can do to sort that out. But I agree. I think that probably is no response and part of the motor. Part of the motor artifact.
The fact that we're even having this conversation about whether it's there in a 21-year-old man is a worrisome sign.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
yeah,
Because if you have a normal 21-year-old man and you were to predict what's the ulnar anti-amplitude going to be, you'd say what, 30,
yeah,
35,
maybe 50.
depends
Yeah,
on
could even
50.
be.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So okay, here's the median antidromic study to the index finger, and lo and behold, as we kind of expected, the peak latency is prolonged, the amplitude's low, the velocity's a little bit slow too. So the lateral antebrachial cutaneous, several of you said that, and that was performed. So as you can see, and I'm showing both the left, the affected side, and then the right. So the amplitude on the left, and in our lab, we don't have a normal lower limit of normal. We compare side to side, and the amplitude was 5 compared to 12. So what do you think? Is that within normal limits, or is that abnormal?
We don't have as you say, we have to compare, and it's greater than 50% difference. So, I'm concerned. It's definitely the symptomatic region, so we were looking for it there. I guess you could argue that the temperature being so much warmer on the side that's lower and cooler on the other side, does that make it 6 in reality versus 11 or something? But still, I think it's a significant difference either way you look at it.
Yeah. And now I guess the significance of this is now we're taking abnormalities outside of sites of compression, right? Kind of. I mean, the lateral anobrachial cutaneous isn't a nerve that's typically compressed. Common compressive sites.
No, maybe for a rock climber, but I'm not
Yeah,
a rock
right.
climber, so I wouldn't
That's
know.
that's right. That's the one catch we don't know about this patient. So the medial anobrachial cutaneous was also performed, and I think the display sensitivity is different on these two, but the amplitude was 6 and 8, so those were pretty similar here.
So that's also informative for the lateral. I mean, they're roughly similar distribution in the arm. So it's helpful and fits with the clinical suspicion about that portion of the plexus or the nerve itself.
Yeah. So now I guess for just from the localization standpoint with just to reiterate what you said, the lateral anobrachial cutaneous being abnormal, it's not root, right? Root should not
Right.
cause low sensory responses if it's preganglionic, so it's postganglionic, and that lateral anobrachial cutaneous fibers course through the musculocutaneous nerve and lateral cord and upper trunk. So
Plus, we have the distal wrist and we have the ulnar at the elbow.
yeah, yeah. So then the radial sensory was performed on the left, and it was 9 with a little bit long latency. So that's pretty low for a 21-year-old.
Absolutely.
That should
That's
be,
abnormal.
yeah. And then in this patient, they did perform the musculocutaneous, and I don't want to spend too much time on this, but just get your thoughts about this. So this is stimulating in the axilla at the top trace, and then at Erb's point in the bottom trace.
Yeah. I mean, 6.9 versus 1. It's hard to know without watching them doing it and seeing the twitch of the muscle. And when you're there at herbs, don't don't quite know which nerve you're stimulating, which nerve you're not stimulating unless you're watching that twitch. But boy, that is a big drop. And if they were satisfied that they should be getting a response and they didn't, then if we believe that, then that would be a almost 100% conduction block. I mean, 1 versus 7. It's a big block anyway.
What do you think about that in the context of his bicep strength being essentially normal or minimally weak?
Makes me feel less likely to buy it. I mean, you would want to see severe weakness for so much conduction block if those two things are really going together. So I'm less apt to, I'm thinking about this as technical, I guess, right
Yeah,
off the bat here. Yeah.
yeah, I agree. As I was going through these again, um, I agree. If this is a true block of going from 7 down to 1, the amplitude, that patient should be at least 50% weak and probably 75% weak in the biceps. And knowing that this is a technically difficult study, motor study, or stimulating weight, that this response at the axilla looks fairly real. It doesn't always have a nice domed appearance, but this is very broad. You really don't have much of a negative response. So I would be really skeptical that this is a true response from the biceps. And remember, the recording electrodes over the biceps can, through volume conduction, can pick up responses from the triceps and brachialis and other muscles that that may be stimulated when you're stimulating at different parts of the plexus.
It looks like there might be an initial positivity there to signify that. And
Yeah,
if you played with the gain, it might, but it
yeah,
looks like, yeah.
yeah. And I guess a question, just a practical question, and see what you think is, do you think it's reasonable to try to do this in this patient, or can we just use the needle exam to test, which is much easier to stick the biceps?
I think I probably would have started with the needle in this situation because the weakness is fairly mild from what I remember on your exam. I don't know that I would have jumped to this right off the bat, but if I
Mhm.
really thought that there was going to be demyelination and I needed to know whether there was demyelination for sure, that would be one way to find it and really prove that it was there. And I have done that. And we've all done that where we go and we see the patient who maybe they didn't do the proximal conductions, they did the standard conductions, the hand, median ulnar, motor sensory. We go in, we do the needle, we see that there's reduced recruitment in a muscle, and yet no fibrillations. And we know something's wrong because the patient's weak and their reflex is gone. And so that's the time when you do want to come back and spend a little more time with it and say, well, this isn't making sense. There could be demyelination. That would be one reason why there's reduced recruitment on the needle and yet no fibrillation. So let's do a nerve conduction and do 2 points or 3 points of stimulation to try to find if there's a block there.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And I think you're right. In this case, there's demyelination at compressive sites. So maybe there's evidence of partial block or focal slowing. And this is a nice nerve where you can stimulate at two sites to look for slowing in the conduction more proximally. So, but as you can see, it's technically not an easy nerve to get reliable results. So. Okay, so quickly to show a few other conductions. So there was some comparison to the other side and same finding on the other median motor, prolonged latency. Same finding on the other ulnar. He's a rock climber. So, but he has ulnar slowing and prolonged latency with focal slowing on inching. His ulnar sensory, do you think this is a real sensory here? Probably.
Yeah, I'm a little more apt to buy that.
So it's a little
Narrower,
narrow,
sharper.
yeah.
Yeah,
Still motor artifact, but yeah.
yeah.
But it's slow and
And it should
prolonged.
probably be more than 13 for this guy. I mean, our
Yep,
normal limit there is 10. So
yep. And then the median sensory on the unaffected side
same thing.
showed similar findings as the affected side. The radial sensory was similar. It was 9 on both sides. So both abnormal, but in terms of localization, does that help you a little bit maybe?
Yeah, so I think what you're getting at is, does this raise the possibility of a more diffuse polyneuropathy, or does he now have multifocal mononeuropathies, like we were saying earlier? I mean, if he does, then this is either possibility, I guess they're subclinical because he didn't notice it, he didn't talk to us about it, and we didn't notice it on our exam. So
Yeah. And
that's what things going through my head.
yeah, and the other thing, and again, patients aren't perfect and don't read the book, but if you're thinking of an upper trunk plexopathy, the radial sensory should be abnormal.
Yeah.
It should be asymmetric, right? And it's symmetric here. So take that however you want. I mean, it could be patchy, but could that indicate that it's not actually the upper trunk in its individual nerves? You have the lateral antebrachial cutaneous that's abnormal, but the radial sensory is symmetric. So how would you know if there's a diffuse neuropathy?
Well, you could ask the patient, you have a
He doesn't have any
neuropathy.
other symptoms.
Well, you could go down and look at the leg.
Yeah. So they also tried the musculocutaneous for comparison on the unaffected side and also didn't get very good responses. So that even makes me further think those are technical. So and some leg conductions were performed in him. So here's the fibular motor showing slowed velocity
Yep.
slightly. F waves were within estimate. The medial plantar was low, and they did a Searle and it was absent.
Hmm.
Why do you say hmm?
I mean, I guess this is shaping up to be more like a Well, you could say multifocal. Now, do you say polyneuropathy plus mononeuropathies? I think that's where my mind goes. You can't
Mhm.
be so hasty, but that's the thing that seems logical based on this so far.
The other reason I said, is you have an absent sural, but you have a medial plantar response.
Plantar. Oh, sure. Yeah.
And not to belabor this point, but the question, like with the ulnar sensory, is this a real response? It kind of looks real, but there's some motor over that. And similar to the ulnar antidrome, like I like when I'm doing these studies, I like to get a response, a plantar response without that's not riding on the motor, because I'm not convinced that this is a real response. It may be, but it's unusual that you get a medial plantar and the sural's absent, I think.
Yeah.
Usually in neuropathy, the plantar goes first and then the sural.
You would think. This is
But
also the latency is wrong. Yeah, as you say, it's a broad response. They're having to go up pretty high. So
yeah.
something's wrong with it
So
one way or
anyway,
another.
anyway, so you as you said, you're suspicious of a more generalized neuropathy with multiple superimposed mononeuropathies and something else up here in one of the nerves up here.
Right.
Okay, so I'm just going to show you, just for the sake of time, the needle exam that was performed. Those were all the conductions that were performed, and this was the needle exam, and you can see that it was performed on the affected side. He had fibrillation potentials in the biceps and deltoid and slightly in the brachialis. And he had some mild reduced recruitment in the biceps, but everything else was pretty much normal. The FDI had some slightly long units. FDIP in the foot had a few fibrillations. So mainly biceps and deltoid, a little bit in the brachialis.
Hmm. Yeah,
So
all coming together.
yeah, so what do you think localization, or does anyone want to type in or answer what you think the localization might be in the arm related to the biceps? What do you think, Chris?
Well, you've got the biceps involved, the brachialis involved, and the deltoid. And yet you've got sparing of the triceps, B5 paraspinals, infraspinatus. So a little patchy, but the muscles involved there, biceps, brachialis have musculocutaneous and and uh, for trunk innervation.
Yeah, but
Uh,
but not infraspinatus.
yeah, maybe it's just distal to the branching point of the
Yeah, unless it's axillary and musculocutaneous.
right.
Could it be that?
Okay,
I mean, that's kind of what I thought as I looked at this. These muscles are
you could
two.
take it to multifocal. It's hard
Yeah,
to summarize in one
right,
lesion.
right, exactly. And the lateral antebrachial cutaneous being asymmetric and the radial sensories being symmetric, I think would fit with a musculocutaneous neuropathy.
Okay, I see what you're saying. So the radial sensories being abnormal are
Being are
maybe
part of the neuropathy.
a part of the polyneuropathy, just
Yeah,
like the FDIP,
yeah,
potentially the FDI of the hand.
yep, yep,
Okay.
yeah. This is like the brachial plexus Olympics, isn't it?
It's like a
These are the
Rubik's Cube.
ones,
Yeah.
I don't know if there's some residents or fellows on, these are tough. Knowing the brachial plexus is very difficult. It's really important to understand the innervation of all these muscles, knowing how the sensory fibers course through the brachial plexus. It's complicated and it's hard and it makes you dizzy thinking about this. And we don't know exactly. This could be a patchy process involving just some axons or some fibers more than others in the brachial plexus. So it's imperfect, I think, in many cases. But to me, that's what makes it interesting and fun. So what would you do? So that's all that was done. What, just out of curiosity, I know I want to leave a few minutes for questions. We're getting close to an hour. But if this was a patient you were seeing, Chris, this was the EMG, you have the story, how would you evaluate, or what would you be thinking in this situation? What would you do?
Yeah. Well, it might be hard to localize which nerves exactly, but I think I can
And to
localize.
not to interrupt you, but if
Yeah.
anyone, I've seen people put in their thoughts, so keep adding your thoughts as Chris is talking.
Yeah. And I think Mike's on the same road here. Maybe I can't localize exactly which nerves, but I think I can localize exactly which gene. And I would probably test the PMP22 gene in this guy and looking for a deletion in HNPP. And somebody said, examine the family, and Mike said HNPP. So this guy's got polyneuropathy that's subclinical. He's got bilateral carpal tunnel ulnar mononeuropathy, and this new unusual story of a compression neuropathy or neuropathy that non-compression site.
Yeah. So that was the thought. In fact, in the EMG report, it was mentioned the localizations and a consideration should be HNPP in this clinical context. And the patient did have genetic testing that showed a mutation in the PMP22 gene, confirming it. So you are very right, exactly right. So I mean, do you need the EMG to raise that suspicion, do you think?
Well, the EMG certainly helped us with these subclinical problems. I mean, if we hadn't really just think if we hadn't done that, if we just released the guy and done surveillance, we might not have known about this polyneuropathy or the median and ulnar. So yes, absolutely. I think that was extremely helpful in my opinion.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. I agree. And I guess the other question, examining family members is very important, as some of you said. Patients' families seem to have some neuropathy. In your experience, when you're asking family members of a patient with HNPP about multiple mononeuropathies, is it more likely that they've had them, or if they say, no, I've never had carpal tunnel or an ulnar neuropathy, does that make it less likely?
Yeah, that's tricky. And I hear what you're getting at, which is, people just get carpal tunnel and have ulnar neuropathy. So they may not even remember getting the surgery, even in a patient who's right in front of you. So if you ask, has your mom ever had carpal tunnel? That they may not remember that. But if it comes through in the history and they say, yeah, my mom's had bilateral carpal tunnel surgery and ulnar surgery and has a polyneuropathy, that's a bit of a red flag. I would pay attention to that for sure.
Yeah. And then my last question, then we'll open it up, is um, what about the fact that the musculocutaneous nerve, if and axillary nerves, let's say that's where the localization was, were affected? Is that unusual? Do you think they're not sites of compression, typical sites?
I think the biggest clue for me that I've learned about HNPP are all these little stories of very, brief, unusual compressive neuropathies. So I can remember seeing a patient in fellowship who carried really heavy grocery bags in the crooks of his elbows. And for a day after doing that, he had numbness in the median distributions of his hand. He could remember that clearly. And he didn't think a whole lot of it because it had happened to him so many other different times. Uh, so patients who have this condition, they have these little stories of compressive neuropathies, unusual compressive neuropathies, and you have to fish for them.
Mhm.
Sometimes they can be a little bit hazy. If they have stuff like that, it can be a huge clue. So
Yeah,
I think this guy, maybe he was rock climbing, had his arm way up above his head, or holding, who knows what position the guy was holding himself in, but maybe like somebody has written here, he's doing biceps curls and he's pressing that
yeah,
nerve somehow or another.
yeah. And the one article, just the last slide I'm going to show is I agree. I mean, so some of you have seen this or proximal nerves affected. There are a couple of papers that have been published of axillary nerve uh, occurring in a patient with HNPP. And this was in from South Korea in the military of patients. They looked at a number of patients that they ultimately found to have HNPP, and they presented with brachial plexopathies. Most of them were due to push-ups as an exercise or as a punishment. So I'm adding to my list of things not to do. Not that I have HNPP, but rock climbing's on the list now, and I think I'll just stop doing push-ups too.
You're gonna have to put a stop to all those push-ups you're doing in the
I
lab all the time,
know.
Devin.
Yeah, but I think this is interesting because you don't think, like we're saying, you don't think that that should cause compression, but those nerves in the brachial plexus can be stretched or compressed with intense activity in someone that's susceptible. So,
Right.
yeah. So anyway, we have a few minutes before we have to go. Thanks for all of your input, everyone, and Chris as well. I think talking through that case it's a nice lesson in anatomy and finding unusual findings that aren't expected in a young patient. Um, we want to open it up, see if anyone has any questions or thoughts or disagreements with us.
This was really fun, Devin. Thanks for inviting me to do this. And what an interesting patient too. It's fun to
Uh,
talk about
it,
patients like this every day in the lab.
Yeah, and I'll ask one other question since I don't see any. If you see a patient with HNPP, well, how do you counsel them? Like, how
I
would you
do,
counsel this kid uh, about preventing nerve injury?
well, you tell them the standard things like don't lean on your elbow, cross your legs, avoid prolonged compression periods. But for the most part, you just you try to help them live their lives. And if they're going to go and rock climbing, you just tell them, you try to educate them about the disease and say, your nerves are more susceptible to these compressive palsies. So anytime you're sitting on your nerve or laying on your nerve or whatever it is you're doing to your nerve when you're rock climbing, be conscious that you have to keep moving and pay attention to the paresthesia signals a
Would
little
you
more
have him?
closely.
Would you tell him not to rock climb,
I
or at
wouldn't.
least
I
stay only about 5 feet off the ground?
move into a bubble inside of his parents' basement.
I mean, we joke, but I wonder how quickly. Probably it wouldn't happen suddenly, but if you're up holding on and you are stretching a nerve or a part of the plexus, could that cause relatively sudden weakness? Probably
Well,
not that quick, but I don't
all
know.
right, so you're advising him not to go free solo Yellowstone.
Yeah,
I
probably
think
not
that's
free
pretty good
solo.
advice.
Use a
Yeah,
harness. Yeah, yeah.
that's good
Well,
advice.
thanks everyone for tuning in I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. I always learn something when I'm listening to everyone's questions and we're talking through a case, and it's even more fun when we are discussing more complicated cases. But hopefully this was useful, and we look forward to seeing everyone next time.